Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this Tuesday afternoon at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. Appreciate your time. So we're going to just jump right in because time is valuable. We're going to have a presentation with Victor and Boz. We got more people coming in. Hi, Carrie. So we're going to get started here. I'll let people in as they come in and make sure that they're muted. Hi, Mark. Hi, Peter. So we've got Victor and Boz, and they're going to do about an hour-long presentation. And then after that, we'll open the room up for questions and answers. So if you could just stay muted until the end, that would be appreciated. I'm going to turn this over to Victor now.
Thanks, Catherine. Good to be with you, and good to be with others from Maine. My name is Victor Vieth. My background is child protection. I've been in the field for 36 years. I was a prosecutor here in Minnesota for a decade, and now for the past 26 years, I've worked at the national level. I currently work for Zero Abuse Project. We operate under a grant from the Department of Justice to provide training, technical assistance, publications to child abuse prosecutors and allied professionals. So that's my primary job day in and day out. One of my areas of expertise, though, is the intersection between religion and child abuse. And so we oversee a number of initiatives, including coursework at seminaries. We have an initiative called Keeping Faith that Catherine hopes to bring to Maine. And I've published a lot of theological works and the like addressing this subject, and have done some research as well. So that's my background. Boz?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Boz Tchividjian, but to keep everybody sane, we'll just say Boz. I am hailing from Florida, so I told Catherine I'm going to cut out early today about 1:40-ish because we've got some wind that's kicking up in the next couple of days that I need to go get ready for. So I know you all don't have hurricanes in Maine, but we don't have snowstorms down here. So I guess it's give and take. But I'm thrilled to be here. I'm a lawyer by trade. I graduated from law school and became a prosecutor. And during my years as a prosecutor, for no other explanation other than God grabbed my attention and heart with this particular issue of sexual abuse and sexual assault. And I ultimately started a sexual crimes unit of our prosecutor's office. And it was during those years where I saw something that troubled me. And what I saw as a Christian was how many of my cases that I had involved in some way, shape, or form a faith community. And I thought, man, I grew up in the church. The church was always a safe space for me, but I'm now realizing for the first time in my life that for many other people, it's not. And that really troubled me. And so one of the things I did after I got out of prosecuting is I thought, man, what do I learn? What do I do with what I've just learned as a prosecutor, especially for the church? What can I do to help the church? What can I do to help people in the church, protect them and help them become much more understanding of this issue? So long story short, with Victor's help in around 2004, we started an organization called GRACE. That stands for Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. I'll put the website in the chat in a little bit. But the whole purpose of GRACE is to train and equip the Christian community on understanding abuse-related issues, learning how to minimize abuse within your own communities, and also responding to abuse in a way that actually draws people to Jesus and not pushes them out the door. And so I've spent my career doing that. I was then became a law professor, and then I decided a few years ago, I think God probably decided for me, that I was going to come back to Florida, and I have a full-time practice where I represent sexual abuse survivors in civil cases, lawsuits around the country. So don't let this concern you, but I do spend my days suing churches and schools and organizations, not because I enjoy doing that, but because the people who come to me oftentimes they've tried everything else, and it's an honor for me to advocate for these wounded sheep and to help them reclaim their agency. And so my hope today is I'm thrilled to be with you all today. I would love to be able to not have any work in 5 years. I'd love to go back to just doing, I could do, car accident cases. That would be great, because that would tell me that the church is finally understanding and stepping up and addressing this issue that goes to the very heart and soul of who we are as God's creation. So I'm happy to be here. Victor's going to lead the conversation. I'm going to chime in. There are a few areas I'm going to talk a little bit further about. And then before I leave at about 1:40, I'll put my email address in the chat, Joe. So if there's something that I said or you have a question specifically for me, you can feel free to reach out to me at any time you want.
Okay. As Boz mentioned, I'll take a lead. We've got about an hour presentation, and this is cut and pasted from a 3-day curriculum that we do called Keeping Faith. And one of Catherine's goals is to bring the 3-day course to Maine. And one of our hopes is that we'll really excite you about the potential content, and that you can take a leadership role in engaging faith communities, so that we can truly make your portion of Maine truly informed in terms of how faith communities respond to the issue of abuse. To that end, toward that goal, we'll chat a little bit about the prevalence of abuse to disabuse you of any notion that you don't have a significant number of congregants and community members who are impacted by maltreatment. We'll chat briefly about what does the research tell us about the physical and the emotional impact of trauma, because your faith leaders will also address the spiritual impact of trauma. And then what does research and common sense tell us as best practices in terms of policies and training on this subject? I'm often asked, how do you broach the subject of abuse with children, young or adolescents or teens? We'll chat about that, because your faith leaders will chat about what is best practice for spiritual care for child or adult survivors of abuse, and then what can we do as faith leaders to instill resilience in those who have been impacted by maltreatment. In terms of prevalence of abuse in the United States, there's a body of research called Adverse Childhood Experiences. The research began at Kaiser Permanente in San Diego in 1998. Began at Kaiser Permanente in 1998, has now been replicated in all 50 states on more than 450,000 adults. And the participants were largely a middle-class population. 3/4 had college education, for example. So you can't look at the ACE research and say, I wouldn't have anybody like that in my congregation or community. And then there are studies done in more urban settings where you've got a higher percentage of folks living below the poverty line, a higher percentage of persons of color. And so the numbers go up from here depending on your individual demographics. But think of these as base levels of trauma in your congregations and communities. So nationwide, about 11% of adults say that they grew up in a home where they were psychologically abused. They had parents or other caregivers who said to them things like, you're stupid, you're ugly, you're fat, I wish you were never born. 28% were beaten. They were hit so hard in their homes that they had manifestations of the blows on their body. They had bruises, cuts, and perhaps more severe injuries such as broken bones. More than 1 out of 4 were beaten as children. In terms of sexual abuse, more than 1 out of 4 women, about 1 out of 6 men nationwide say they were sexually abused, typically in their own homes during their childhood. 13% grew up in a home where their mother was beaten. So 13% of children know what it's like to see mom with eyes that are blackened, or she can't get out of bed in the morning because her ribs are so sore because of the beating she endured the prior evening. 10% were neglected physically, meaning they had parents who had the means to provide for their basic necessities, and yet purposefully, willfully at times withheld food, clothing, shelter, medical care, other necessities of life. 15% were emotionally neglected, which is different than emotional abuse. Emotional abuse is proactive. You're ugly, you're stupid, I wish you were never born. Emotional neglect means you grew up in a home where nobody said, I love you, I care about you, you're special, you're a really great kid. 15% had no idea what it was like to have a tender word uttered to them. So that's the prevalence of trauma in your congregations and communities. How is it impacting your parishioners? Again, the ACE research analyzed that, and they found that if you fit into just one category of abuse, it doesn't matter which of the categories, if you just fit into one category, then statistically speaking, throughout your life, you are more likely to suffer from hundreds of medical and mental health conditions, including things we would never think of being correlated with child abuse, things such as cancer. Now, why might cancer correlate to child abuse? Well, some of it's just common sense. If you've endured trauma, you're more likely to smoke and engage in other behaviors to address your anxiety, and these behaviors in turn increase your risk for cancer. However, in the ACE studies, even if they isolated your contributory behaviors, they found that trauma changes the development of your brain. It weakens your immune system. All of us every day have bodies that are developing cancer cells, but for most of us on most days, our immune system is taking care of that. Well, if you've endured significant childhood trauma, your immune system is weaker and you're more susceptible to disease such as cancer or heart disease. You're more likely to have sexually transmitted diseases, liver disease. You're more likely to smoke, to abuse alcohol. As the original ACE study found, you're more likely to suffer from obesity, to be dependent on drugs, to be an IV drug user, to engage in early intercourse, to be pregnant before you leave high school, to suffer from mental health conditions such as depression. 54% of women, 36% of men diagnosed with depression were abused in 4 or more categories as a child. Other mental health conditions, anxiety, hallucinations, disturbances in your sleep, disturbances in your memory, a tougher time controlling your anger, more likely to be either a perpetrator or victim of interpersonal violence, tougher time holding a job throughout your life cycle, a tougher time developing healthy relationships. Here's a study that bears out how this plays out in the life of a child. So all these kids in this study grew up in homes where it was documented that their mothers were being beaten, which is about 13% of children in the United States. And they found it was impacting them even in infancy. These babies were noticeably fussier. They didn't respond very well when an adult was trying to coo them. They couldn't sleep. They couldn't eat very well. And in preschool, they were aggressive in preschool. They yelled, they were irritable, they couldn't sleep at nap time, they were really nervous around strangers, and then the aggression continues in school age. These were the ones that are disobedient to their teachers or other authority figures. They just couldn't make very good friends. And then as they approach adolescence, these are kids who are often being exposed to violence when they start to date. These are the kids who get into the juvenile court system as delinquents. They run away from home, they're truant from school, they engage in early and frequent sexual activity and an increased risk to become pregnant at young ages. They then looked at the impact on their cognitive and emotional functioning, and I just want to highlight one finding. The researchers in this study were documenting PTSD in children as young as 4 years of age. That's the sort of diagnosis you give somebody who's been in combat or tortured as a prisoner of war. They were giving that diagnosis to children growing up in violent homes. Your faith leaders. So in addition to being concerned about the physical and the emotional impact of trauma, what does research tell us about the impact on our spirituality, the impact on our faith? There's a huge and growing body of research on this subject. This American Psychological Association literature review was published in 2009. At that time, there were 34 major studies in the United States alone on more than 19,000 abused children, and more than 50% of these children were profoundly spiritually impacted as a result of abuse. Here's one study that's illustrative. In this study, there were 527 victims of child abuse. Every child in the study was spiritually wounded, which manifested itself in feelings of guilt, anger, grief, despair, doubt, afraid of dying, a belief that God is unfair. What on earth are we talking about? Some years ago, I was part of a team that investigated physical and sexual abuse in a Christian boarding school from the 1980s, and I saw the research come to life before me. I interviewed a man who said, "Victor, do you think that God understands ACE research?" And I said, "Tell me about that." And he said, "Well, I understand it. I got beaten at this boarding school. They raped me at this boarding school. All my other friends were beaten or raped at this school. One day they pulled out one of my teeth without any Novocaine. You know, my very best friend killed himself at this boarding school. So I get it, he says. I got an A score through the stratosphere. And that no doubt explains why, as a young man, I became addicted to drugs and alcohol. It explains why I had 3 failed marriages. It explains why I used to go into a bar on Friday nights and get drunk and pick a fight with the biggest fellow in the bar because it just felt so good to hit somebody. But the worst thing I ever did, Victor, is I killed somebody. I was high on drugs one day. I accidentally crossed the divider in the highway. I struck another car. I took a man's life. So they sent me to prison for criminal vehicular homicide. Well, I'm out of prison. I got a pretty good job as a mechanic. I've been clean from drugs for a year, but I'm really scared of dying because if I die tonight, how does God sort out my life? Do I get a pass? Does God say, yeah, you did some wicked things, including killing a person, but you had a miserable childhood, so I'm going to look the other way, and on you can go into paradise? Or does God hold me accountable for my many and great sins? That is a spiritual injury. I once talked to a woman who was sexually abused at a Christian boarding school by a doctor, and the doctor said, "You're so lucky, you're so special. I could touch sexually any child in my care, but I purposely selected you because of all the adolescent girls I'm working with, your breasts are the most developed." She told me she developed this tremendous anger toward God. God is all-knowing, so he must have realized that if my breasts grew early, this man would be attracted to me. I'm just so mad at God, she told me. That, too, is a spiritual injury. Interestingly, although this and other studies have found that those who are spiritually wounded often distance themselves from organized religion, one man in that case said, "I ain't going to do it, Victor. I'm never, ever going to go back to church. I think church is just the cover for the abuse of children." But at the same time, he said, "You know what? I get up early every morning, and I read the Bible for a good hour. I pray for a good 30 minutes before I drive myself to the office." And I said, "Tell me about that. Tell me about reading the Bible and praying before you go to work each day." And he got emotional, and he said, "I don't know. I don't know why I do it. I guess after all these years," he said, "I'm still searching for something." Viktor Frankl said, "It is not suffering that is unbearable. It is suffering without meaning." And spirituality is often how victims make sense of their meaning, and yet that's the very part of their psyche that is the most damaged as a result of abuse. Well, that's a quick overview of what we would spend a good 8 hours on if you come to our Keeping Faith course. But it leads to the question, okay, with trauma so prevalent, so wounding, driving so many young people away from our faith communities, how do we address this? In terms of protecting children from sexual abuse, there's 3 things faith communities need to do. We need to educate ourselves that not all sex offenders are the same. Some are much more dangerous than others. We need to figure out, how do we manage a convicted or known sex offender who comes into our church? And then, most importantly, we need policies to protect kids from the unknown sex offenders. Those are the ones who are the most dangerous, because we just don't know who they are or how they may be operating. With respect to sex offenders and how complex they are, the American Psychological Association, as well as a number of studies from Europe and the United States on the general population, have found that about 10% of adult men and about 4% of adult women admit they have some sexual thoughts about children. They wouldn't necessarily act out on them. They may not have acted out on them, but every once in a while it crosses their mind to sexually touch a child. So 1 out of 10 men and a little less than 1 out of 20 women have some sexual thoughts about children. Many of these potential offenders are known as situational offenders. They wouldn't do it unless all the conditions are right, all the stars are aligned, and they're really confident that they could get away with it. Under those circumstances, they might strike, they might sexually abuse a child. That's most sex offenders. Now, the offenders we typically worry the most about and we hear the most about are those who are preferential sex offenders. They could be diagnosed as either a pedophile or a hebephile. These are diagnosable conditions. A pedophile is somebody with intense sexual urges for a prepubescent child. A hebephile has the same sort of sexual thoughts and desires, but they're really focused on adolescents or very young teens. The American Psychiatric Association says somewhere between 3 to 5% of adult men would meet diagnostic criteria for pedophilia, meaning that is their preferred sexual interest. Very few female offenders, though, meet diagnostic criteria for pedophilia. There are, of course, female offenders. They're just rarely the Jerry Sandusky sort of predators. Now, to make it further complicated, not everybody who would meet diagnostic criteria for pedophilia goes on to sexually abuse children. Some are able to withstand those urges, and not everybody who sexually abuses a child would meet diagnostic criteria for pedophilia or hebephilia. It's so complex. To really illustrate, you need to be working with an expert when and if you are encountering a sex offender in your community. So I'll turn it over to Boz to chat a little bit about how do you manage somebody who's been convicted of sexual abuse or has confessed to sexual abuse and seeks membership in your congregation or is already a member of your church. Boz?
Thank you, Victor. Yeah, this is probably one of the most difficult issues that we encounter when we are helping churches. Because if you walk into a church, you say, how many of you want to prevent children in this church from being sexually victimized? Everybody's going to raise their hand, at least I hope, right? And so everybody generally is on the same page with regard to that. The problem oftentimes is not the protection, but what do we do about the known and known and, as Victor said, known and unknown offenders? That is oftentimes, especially when something comes to light, that is oftentimes where we see churches begin to fall apart in how they respond and deal with these issues, primarily because when the known offender is somebody inside the church, when it is somebody who's known, who is beloved, who's respected, that creates a huge dilemma oftentimes for church leaders. I'm a big believer, based on my experience, that we gravitate towards the narratives that we prefer. So if, for example, there's a youth pastor who is well loved by the church, the kids love this particular person, and somebody steps forward to disclose some form of sexual victimization by this youth pastor, the natural, and I'm not saying it's wrong, because I think it's sort of the natural inclination is for us to go, no, we know this person. He would not do this. And so it's easier for me to gravitate towards a narrative that this child is making this up. We really don't know this child. What kind of family does this child come from? We start building sort of a case almost against the person who stepped forward to report, because that's easier for us to do than to acknowledge the possibility that this particular person that we know and have a relationship with could have engaged in such reprehensible behavior. When I tell churches, I say, if we oftentimes ask yourself if you would respond differently if the known reported offender is a leader in the church versus the custodian that you hired 2 weeks ago. More often than not, the custodian is going to be without a job within hours of this disclosure coming forward, whereas the person who's been there for a while and everybody knows that person, it's going to be a struggle in how the church responds. So we could spend a whole day on this topic, and we could probably get into some really interesting conversations. What I want to share with you, just some basics, and I think if we do this 3-day conference, we'll dig much deeper into this particular issue and even have some case studies that we can talk through, because it's one thing to listen to a PowerPoint, it's another to be given a sort of a real life situation, go, okay, now what do you do? I think what Victor said is so critically important, and that is the need for policies. A few years ago, I co-wrote a book called the Child Safeguarding Policy Guide. Here it is. And it was for this purpose, because so many churches and church leaders were reaching out to Grace going, hey, do you have a policy that we can adopt for our church? And we did that for a while until one day I realized, all we're doing is cutting and pasting. And do they really understand what is at the heart of the policies that we're sending them, versus what if we encourage them to develop their own policies with our assistance? Then they can actually understand and take ownership of these policies and procedures for their church. And so I, along with a good friend of mine, Shira Berkovitz, wrote this book, and it's sort of an ABC on how to develop policies in your church. And one of the areas, there's prevention policies, but there's also response policies. How do you develop protocols so when somebody does step forward and says, this person did this to me, instead of going, well, what do? We like this person. We don't, and we're not sure how to handle this. You go, wait a minute. It doesn't matter whether this is the custodian or the senior pastor. We have a policy and protocol already adopted, and we're going to follow it. And we're going to treat these situations consistently. And that I can tell you, when you have those policies and procedures up front, it is the amount of pressure taken off of leadership, who is oftentimes at a standstill because they don't know what to do. They suddenly find that this friend of theirs who might serve on the session or the deacon board has been accused of something, but they also have been told that they're supposed to believe victims, and they're frozen. And knowing that this is a pivotal moment, whatever decision you make as a church leadership when these situations come forward, becomes a pivotal moment in the lives of those not only impacted by this, but of everybody watching what you're going to be doing. Because keep in mind, just as Victor was talking about the statistics of abuse, if you take those statistics, I think the math is right. If you had a church of 100 men and 100 women, about a little over 20% of your church congregation would be survivors of sexual abuse. That means that you probably don't know most of the people in your church who are survivors, because they've decided, for whatever reason, it's their decision to not share that with you. But it also means that they're watching. They're watching when a situation like this surfaces. Believe me, they are watching what you do and how you respond. And so having those policies in place are critical, and inviting the congregation to play a significant role in the development of those policies. And any known survivors of sexual abuse who are interested, who want to have a seat at the table in helping to develop these policies, please, by all means, invite them to be a part of that process. So having those policies are critical. And then the other aspect of known offenders is, okay, not when somebody comes forward and says, this person has done this to me. What happens if you get a call one day from a guy named, let's say Charles, and Charles says, hey, we've visited your church a couple of times. We want to become regular members, but I want to tell you that 10 years ago, I was convicted of child sexual abuse, and I want to let you know that. The question then becomes for you as a leader is, what do you do with that? What do you do with that information? And I find that the people who are the least informed about this issue are the ones that take the most extreme measures on either side of it. And so you have to educate yourself on this issue and have policies and procedures that address this issue as well. Because somebody who comes, I've had pastors say, well, why would the very fact that person self-disclosed means that I can trust him. Therefore, he's welcome to worship in our church, because he's an honest person. But if we had to find out about him, that we might not have trusted him as much. Well, okay, that might work, except that sex offenders oftentimes are some of the most deceitful human beings on the face of the earth. And so there's a story in a book that was written by a well-known psychologist, Dr. Anna Salter, who she gives the example of a person who comes knocking at the door of the church and says, I'd like to come worship. I just got out of prison. Oh, well, what are you in prison for? I got out of prison for writing a bad check or worthless check. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so glad you self-reported. Well, long story short, that person ended up getting involved with the church, ultimately was accused of sexually abusing children in the church. And when they went back to do the research, they found out, yes, in fact, he had come out of prison, but it wasn't because he had wrote a bad check. It's because he had molested children. But because he self-reported, the initial response was, hey, this is a person we can trust. So we don't need to verify what he's told us. So I think that policies go a long way in helping you understand the issue, helping you figure out for your particular church what you want to do. And then when those situations come up, you're not just shooting from the hip, but you're going, okay, we've already talked through this, and this is how we're going to handle it. I know some churches that say, listen, known offenders are not free to worship in corporate worship for our church. And quite frankly, that's sort of my personal preference. And that's a whole other topic for another day. But there's other churches that say, well, we'll make sure they're chaperoned. Well, again, being educated becomes critical because, I had a very, very good friend of mine who's an expert in this, a psychologist, who said, Boz, it's when you're sitting in the church service, the most dangerous thing is not below the person's waist, it's between their ears. What are they thinking? What are they seeing? I spoke with a convicted sex offender a few years ago, and he was talking about wanting to become an active member of his church, and the church was really hesitant. And he was very upset with that because he told me, he said, I've never acted out with a child at the church, and I can't believe they would do this to me. First of all, when somebody's that defensive about that's always a red flag. But in the same course of that conversation, he said, I don't lust at children at church, but sometimes when I'm at the grocery store, I might see a child and I might be sexually attracted to that child, but I don't act out. I never have touched a child. I said, well, what do you do with that? What do you do with that? He goes, well, sometimes I might go home and masturbate, and I'm thinking about that child. And I said, so you want to go to church? I said, because I don't want my child's face being the one that you're thinking of when you're going home. I said, so you did act out on him. And see how he had deceived himself into thinking that he was not acting out when in fact he was. And so we have a responsibility as church leaders more than anything else. I'm a believer of this as it relates to sex offenders and managing sex offenders in a church. Your ultimate responsibility when all is said and done as a church leader is to the most vulnerable in your midst. And the most vulnerable in your midst are the children. So if at some point in time you're ever put in a position where you're like, I don't know, I either have to veer on the side of the known offender or on the side of the child, I'm going to implore you to please always veer on the side of the child, because the child is the vulnerable one. And God has entrusted you with that unique position. Now, again, we could go on and on with this topic, and I really look forward to an in-person discussion about this, because I do think it's something we have to wrestle through. But I also want to close with this. What Victor said earlier is also very true, and that is, I've just been talking about known reported offenders. The vast majority of sex offenders are unknown, okay? So when you talk about the number of people who've been caught and convicted of a sexual offense, it's like, Victor probably would know the statistics, but it's minutia compared to the actual offenders. And so what that tells us is, so oftentimes we're so focused on the known offenders, which we need to be, that we lose sight of the fact that there are many unknown offenders in our midst. And that's why it's so critical that you develop a comprehensive child safeguarding policies and procedures in your church that don't just address the known offenders, but they help create a culture of protection within your church so that even with the unknown offenders, your children are safer with those policies than without those policies. And make sure, at the end of the day, this last thing I'll say is make sure that your church is not just developing those policies, but live out those policies. Make sure that those policies become part of the very DNA of your church. Because at the end of the day, if the church is not the safest place for children, then we should stop calling ourselves the church. Because the God of the universe had some of the most amazing, beautiful things to say about children. And he had some of the most difficult, hard things to say about those who hurt children. So we have to begin to know that it starts with our church can't just say we want to protect children. We can't just have policies that protect children. We have to say those policies are very real and active in our church. And not just the leaders are aware of them, but every congregation member is fully aware of the policies of our church. Every congregation member has a copy of our policies. You should never have to have somebody come and ask you, hey, do you have a copy of the policies? Make them readily available, because that's ultimately, in the long term, how you create a safer space for the most vulnerable in your midst.
Hey, Boz, I did put the policy that you and Shara and Victor created. That is free on my Stop Trafficking US website. I hope they get your book, and we'll put the title of your book on the chat so they can have it. But those policies, they can have them in 5 minutes.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you, Catherine. And I'm going to cut out in about 5 minutes to do the things I need to do. But I am so grateful for you all being here. I can't tell you, somebody's been doing this for almost 30 years. To see a room full of church leaders, mostly men, sitting in and taking time out of your day to learn about this is incredibly encouraging for me. So thank you.
If they have questions later for you specifically, how can they reach you?
I will put my email in this in the group chat, and you can just cut and paste it from there.
Thank you, Boz. I know the hurricane is headed your way, and I'm just hoping.
Never a dull moment in crazy Florida.
Right. Thank you, Boz.
Thanks, Boz. Boz mentioned the Child Safeguarding Policy Guide that he co-authored with Dr. Shira Berkovitz from Sacred Spaces, which is an organization that works to address abuse in the Jewish community. I just think it's a must-have for every faith community. Folks often call me and say, can you send me the cookie-cutter perfect child protection policy? And I can't, because a policy for, say, a megachurch is going to be different from for a church for a rural community in Iowa, and that's going to be different for a community in Florida that has 80% of folks who are elderly. So the beauty of this book is that chapter by chapter can walk you through, given the demographics of your community, what sort of policy best fits. And then when you've put together a policy, you need to send it to me or Boz or another child abuse expert to review and tinker with it. The unknown sex offender is much more prevalent than the known sex offender. One study found that only 3% of those who sexually abuse children are ever caught. This is Jerry Sandusky at Penn State. We all now know he's a serial predator, but for most of his life, he seemed shiny and clean on the outside and was so amazing with how he cared for children. He was a devout Christian. He was regular in church attendance, often took his victims to his church. He was the chaplain for the Protestants on the Penn State football team. So he looked like a great Christian from the outside. But today we know he is a serial predator. So how do you protect children in your congregation from somebody like this who may be attending? The Centers for Disease Control in 2007 convened a national group of child abuse experts, and they developed these guidelines. Now, the guidelines are being updated. A new and better version should come out in the next year or so. But they said you need to have policies in each of these 7 areas. You need to have policies on how you screen and select your volunteers and your employees. And they recommend a number of pre-employment screenings. So let's say you've got a basketball ministry and your basketball coach just had a heart attack, can't finish out the season. So you put an advertisement in the church bulletin, hey, we need somebody to coach the boys for the rest of the year. And one of your applicants is a former All-American and would have made the NBA, except he blew out his knee. And you're so excited, this is who I want to coach my team. Well, before you hire that person, the CDC says you'd want to send him or her your child protection policies. You want to make them read it. You'd want to ask them, hey, do you understand these policies? And if you have any questions, jot it down on the form here. And then you want to do an in-person interview, and then you want to give them some hypotheticals. Okay, you read our policies, you say you understand them. I just want to give you a hypothetical to see if you really do. Let's say at basketball practice, you notice bruises up and down the legs of one of the boys, and you say, what's going on here, Billy? And Billy says, oh, it was bad last night, coach. My dad was wailing on my mom, and I tried to stop him, and he took out his belt, and he wouldn't stop hitting me, and it's just really bad, and I'm scared to go home tonight. Under our policy, what do you do? And if the would-be coach says, well, Matthew 18, I don't want to make a false accusation against anybody. I'd want to talk to the parent before I do anything. Wrong answer, wrong answer. Our policy says if you have a reasonable suspicion of abuse, you make a report to the authorities. You may also make a report to the Child Protection Committee at your church so they can take additional precautions. But your primary obligation is to contact the authorities. There's a verse in Romans that says we should respect the government and respect their expertise in responding to potential crimes against a child. Now, here's the tricky part. The would-be sex offender knows how to answer that question. They would say to you, I can't believe anybody would beat up a child. I know it's just a hypothetical, but just thinking about it is making me upset. And of course, I'd contact the authorities. And you're fooled. You think, oh, well, this is the perfect person for coaching the basketball team. He really is going to care for our youth. Well, if the sex offender knows how to answer that question, why on earth would any expert recommend that you pose it as part of the application process? Well, there's a couple of benefits. First of all, it may aid you in identifying those who just won't enforce your policies. Some people are just uncomfortable acting to protect children from abuse. They don't ever want to contact the police. They don't ever want to run the risk they'll have to testify in a court of law. And that's okay. Let's find that out early so we can find a ministry for you where you're not responsible for matters of child protection. So it may help you identify those who won't enforce your policy. And in terms of the sex offender, although they know how to answer the question, it makes them uncomfortable. They go home that night and they think, oh my word, I think these people are serious, right? Instead of asking me, do I prefer zone or person-to-person defense, they're asking me all these questions about child protection. I think they're serious. I actually think they believe they have to care for the children God has entrusted to them. This is not safe for me. I don't think I want to be part of this church. I think I'm going to go to the church down the street. And the CDC says you want to ask for references, and not just a written reference, but a personal reference. And they recommend some questions you can pose as well. Background checks are fine. They just won't catch hardly anybody. I mentioned a moment ago Jerry Sandusky. He would have passed a background check most of his life. So go ahead and do it. Every once in a while it'll catch somebody, but don't fool yourself to think that it's going to do very much good. So that's why the Centers for Disease Control says if the employment law in your state allows you to do it, you may want to do a comprehensive social media background check on would-be employees. And what would that look like? Well, you might check their social media page. And let's say you check somebody's page and they've got 200 friends and 70% of them are adolescent girls. And there's no evidence of a crime, but the applicant posted a YouTube video saying, I know some of you girls are starting to date. A boy may ask you to French kiss them. You may not know how to do that. Here's a really good video. Do you want that person teaching Sunday school at your church? No. And then when you dismiss him, you say it's not because you're a sex offender. We don't know if the person is or not. It's simply because in looking at your social media page, it falls well below the moral standards we expect of somebody who's going to be a leader of youth. Well, they still get in. They're still active teaching Sunday school or another ministry. So the CDC says you need to have policies to monitor the behaviors of your employees and your volunteers. If you're going to have an outing, say a camp outing or whatever it may be, they recommend 2 deep leaders. So you've got at least 2 adults around the youth at all times. And if you have a big enough church, I don't want, say, a husband and wife team or 2 best friends. Why? Because if you love the other adult, you may cut them some slack if they violate one of your policies. So ideally, I don't want 2 people who are all that close to one another. Ideally, I would want a Democrat and a Republican because they're not going to cut either party any slack. Just a little bit of humor there. And you may not have the resources for that, so you may have to have a husband and wife team. But if your church is big enough, try not to have people who are closely aligned with one another. No one-on-one contact. If you have to remove a youth from the group setting because their behavior is out of control, whatever it may be, it should still be in the eyesight of another adult. We want to try to respect the privacy of youth. We don't want an adult showering with them or going into the bathroom when they are using a urinal or the like. Why? Again, think of Sandusky at Penn State. What did he do? He would shower naked with the boys. Why? It was part of grooming. He could see if they were comfortable being nude around him. He could raise questions about the development of their body and so on and so forth. Now, some people say, well, kind of makes sense, but what if, say, there's an emergency in the room where the kids are showering? Well, you can always write into your policy that if there's an emergency, a child's having a seizure or whatever, you can violate the policy to protect a child, and then you fill out a form. It goes to your Child Protection Committee. They sign off. Yep, there was an emergency. There's a good reason for violating the policy. If you're going to have an overnight trip, separate sleeping accommodations for adults and youth. Now, you may have to do spot checks on where the youth are sleeping, but then it should be 2 adults going into the cabin and the like. Limit or prohibit events at a worker's home. Why? If a worker were an offender, they'd love to have kids on their turf. They know all the nooks and crannies of their house, how they could get away with a crime easily, even with other people present. Now, you may have a small community. You have to have some events at a worker's home. Then you just think about, how do I make it as safe as possible? Let's say it's a 2-story house. So your rule could be, hey, adults use the bathroom on the 2nd story, youth use the bathroom on the 1st floor, and again, you've got 2 adults present, and so on and so forth. It just becomes a way of life. How do we make all of our ministries safe? We're not skinny dipping. We're not making sexual comments around youth. The United States Department of Education says the teachers who are most likely to sexually abuse a child are Phy-Ed teachers and music teachers. Why? It's not because if you have musical or athletic interests, you're more likely to sexually abuse a child. It's simply because those are the educators who have the most socially acceptable reasons to be alone with the child. So the Department of Education says, okay, we get it. You may have to have that one-on-one trombone lesson if you're a music teacher, but there's no reason why there can't be a big window in the door so that people walking by can see exactly what is or is not going on in that room. And we should have in our ministries an open door policy where others can walk in and out of the classroom freely and see if you're doing anything nefarious. Strictly prohibit sexual comments, jokes, and sexual behaviors around youth. Why? Well, we know from research that the top tier of grooming is offenders to say to a child something about their own sex life, or to ask a child about their own sexual thoughts or desires, and sort of gauge their comfort level. So don't get me wrong, I'm not opposed to sex education or healthy conversations about sexuality. Kids need those conversations with trusted adults. We're talking about crass jokes, dirty humor, talking about your own sexual experiences with youth. These things must be strictly prohibited, and those who engage in them should be removed from ministry. Corporal punishment, we know from 1,500 studies, doesn't do any good and elevates the risk for poor outcomes. But we also know that sex offenders like corporal punishment because if they're in a school that allows it, they now have a socially acceptable reason to touch a buttock that for some of them may be arousing. We need policies that strictly limit cameras, imaging, digital devices. My wife, my daughter are both Christian school teachers. And at my wife's school, if the kids go into the changing room to get ready for basketball practice, they'll have to put their cell phones on a table. An adult guards them, and that way we can make sure they're not taking pictures of one another or the like, which they could use in bullying or to threaten somebody. If you don't submit to a sexual request, this is going to go on social media platform and the like. So think about how we're going to handle that. And your anti-bullying policy is also a child protection policy. Why? Because a sex offender kind of likes bullying. They can become the hero to the victim, and then it becomes part of how they worm their way into the victim's life. Or they could reach out to the bullier who may have experienced trauma, and then everybody thinks, oh, what a good Christian you are as you're reaching out to that troubled kid. And then if that kid ever makes an outcry against you, you've got that sort of built-in defense. So your anti-bullying policy is also a child protection policy. The most important policy, the one that the vast majority of faith leaders simply don't do, is training. The sex offender who might be in your church, they're not all that scared about your policies, because if they're really intent on sexually abusing a child, they'll figure out to get around them. What does terrify them is training. The idea that some of you might go to a 3-day training on child abuse absolutely terrifies them. And if you follow the CDC guidelines and say every single year our volunteers and adults are going to go through mandated reporter and other training, and every single year we're going to do personal safety training for our youth, and every single year we're going to work with parents and educate them about what they can do to keep children safe, that is the most terrifying thing you can do, the number one thing you can do to deter those from acting out sexually against your children. Every Catholic school in the United States every year does personal safety training. The vast majority of public schools do personal safety training because Aaron's Law requires it, but the vast majority of Protestant schools do not. And I would say, does it really take a lawsuit before we follow best practices? All right. Which leads then naturally to the question of how do we, as clergy persons or as others in the faith community, how do we talk to children and youth about these really difficult subjects? And how do we advise parents to talk to their children about these very difficult subjects? If you come to the 3-day training, we'll spend about 3 hours on this subject alone and do a deep dive on how you implement personal safety training at your church. But as a quick insight, we need to teach youth the actual names for their penises, vaginas, buttocks, nipples, etc. Because if we can't use those names, the child gets the idea there must be something dirty that I have these intimate parts of the body. So that's a problem. Second of all, let's say they are sexually abused by a Sunday school teacher, and then they come up to you, the pastor, or somebody else, and say, Miss Jones touched my coochie. Well, what the heck is your coochie, right? We may dismiss it. We don't really understand what they're communicating. But if they come up to you because they've been taught the actual name for their vagina and say, Miss Jones touched my vagina, you're not going to be confused what they're communicating, and you're much more likely to act to protect them. So teach children we don't have to be ashamed that we have a penis, a vagina, buttocks, nipples, and just actually use those names. And then let children know that they can say no if somebody's touching them and they're uncomfortable. So I've got 5 grandkids. My oldest is Emma. And she was here visiting, and then when she leaves, her dad says, hey, want to give hugs? And she just said no. And we respect that. You don't have to hug grandma and grandpa or anybody else if you're just not feeling like that. So let them know early on that they have some say in whether or not people are going to touch their body, and that just needs to become a way of life. And then teach kids personal safety rules. Hey, somebody asks you to get in their car or to go into their house or wants to give you a gift or wants to take your picture or says, oh, there's a change in plans and you need to come with me to this part of the camp, to teach them, hey, that's not part of the rules. I need to check first with my mom or dad or my teacher or another responsible authority. If they're going to go on a trip, teach them to have a buddy system. And let them know if they got a butterfly in their feeling, they can trust their gut. It just doesn't feel right. No adult should ever say to a child, this is a secret. This is just between you and me. Let them know that adults don't keep secrets with children. And if somebody's asking them to keep something a secret, that's a red flag, and you really need to talk to mom or dad or somebody else about that. Give them a family password. So if they're on a camp outing and a youth director touched them sexually and they're on the cell phone, but the youth director is 5 feet away, let them know that there's a password, whatever it might be, that they can say to you that lets you as a mom or dad know, I'm in trouble, I need some help, you need to come and get me right away. Teach them that and let them know not to use that password with anybody other than mom and dad. Adults don't come to kids for help, right? Adults go to other adults and let them know if an adult is saying, hey, can you help me with a cat that got caught in my fence? That just shouldn't seem right. They should be asking another adult for that and say, I have to check first. I got to ask my mom if that's okay for me to help you with that. And let them know private parts, there's nothing to be ashamed about, but they're different parts of your body. And if somebody is touching you there and it's not a doctor or it's not a parent helping you wash, that's something you should tell others about. And then make it concrete with what we call what if games, right? So what if your neighbor offered to give you a ride home from school so you wouldn't have to walk? What if? What should you do with that? Well, my rule would be I'd have to check first. I'd have to call my mom and say, is that okay, right? I have to check with an adult, even though I know you and you seem to be a trusted neighbor. What if an older kid says, hey, I'll give you $5 if you play a secret game with me? Oh, people are not supposed to ask me to keep secrets, and they shouldn't give me money for a secret. I got to check first with mom or dad. I got to tell them about that and just practice that. On our website, under our Jacob Weatherly Resource Program, we just got a ton of what-if games that parents can print out and just periodically do it with kids to practice these rules. Teenagers are so much different than the little kids. And so if you come to our 3-day course, we do a deep dive on the research of the teenage mind. If you got teenagers, it might be really helpful for nothing else. And the research says their brain develops differently than we're contemplating. The part of their brain that says that's not a good idea, that develops last. And the part of their brain that just reacts with emotion develops first. And that's why teenagers sometimes do really dumb stuff. They make really bad decisions. I remember being a teenager and my buddies would say to me, I was the first one in our group to have a car, and they would say to me, let's drive on the ice. And I knew it wasn't safe yet, but they would say, oh, you're a chicken if you don't drive onto the ice, right? And so I drove onto the ice with them, and by the grace of God, the car didn't fall through because my brain wasn't fully developed. The part of me that says that's a really bad idea, that was overridden by the emotional part of the brain. I just can't stand the idea of being called names. And so that's why kids sometimes make really bad decisions, and we just need to understand that as adults. This was a national study where they found a lot of adolescents and teens had been solicited online for sexual purposes, and only 5% told their parents or pastors or teachers or others. And the reason is mom and dad and teachers and others never talked to me about this sort of stuff. And I did some stupid things. They asked me to take a picture of my genitals, and I did. And now they've said, you know, I'm going to show everybody in the world if you don't go a little further and submit to my sexual desires. And I'm sure I'll lose my cell phone. I'm sure I'll lose my laptop. I'm sure my parents will be very angry with me. And so we say, parents, you got to say to kids, if you get in over your head, and even if you've done something stupid, you can always come to me. I'm always going to be in your corner. I'm always going to help you try to get out of this mess. And if we don't give that sort of education and constantly reinforce it, this is not a one and done sort of thing. If we're not constantly reinforcing it, kids are very easy to be taken advantage of. I mentioned our Zero Abuse Project, Jacob Welling Resource Center. We have a whole program to work with churches and other youth organizations and parents on talking to kids about these difficult subjects. Your faith leaders, this is a really great resource to put in the hands of parents. Justin and Lindsay Hopkin. Justin's an Episcopal priest, he's now a bishop. His wife Lindsay is a survivor of abuse, and they came to us and said, we want to do a personal safety book that has some faith-based messages that Christian or other parents could read to their little kids. And so they wrote this book, and we critiqued it, and they adopted all of our recommended changes. It's just a great resource. So if you've got a parent who says, I don't know how to talk to my 4-year-old about this stuff, here's a really good book. And it's not scary. It's just say, God made all of me, including the parts between my legs. I don't have to be ashamed of that. And sometimes a doctor or somebody else may have to touch them, but if it's not in one of those situations, you can let us know, right? And also let kids know that if they didn't tell right away, you're not going to be upset with them, right? Sometimes it's scary. They don't know what to do. They don't tell for months or a year or whatever it may be. You can always come to us. And whenever you come to us, we're always going to be in your corner. How do you care for a child or an adult who's been victimized by one or more forms of abuse? Again, if you come to our course, we'll spend a half day on this subject, and you'll get to practice in small group work groups. There's a lot of good news out there that says if we can help a victim of abuse develop a healthy sense of spirituality, it's a huge buffer against these potential consequences of trauma. Study after study after study has found that. John Hopkins did a national study comparing those who had a really high ACE score, who maintained a healthy connection to their faith community, and those who did not. And those who maintained a healthy spirituality, it was a significant buffer against the trauma. They still may have been impacted, but they were doing a whole lot better than those who had no spirituality. This study, done at the Dallas Children's Advocacy Center, found among adolescent children of sexual abuse, those who had a healthy spirituality, it was the most important buffer, the most significant source of resilience. And this study found among abused adolescents and teens, the two most important sources of resilience were getting at least one caring adult in their corner and a healthy sense of spirituality. And it wasn't either or. It wasn't like if I get one of the two, you're good to go. Both of them had an added benefit. And the reason appears to be if I get, say, a non-offending caregiver, let's say mom in the corner of the abused child, that child knows somebody's going to feed me every day, clothe me every day, help me get on the school bus, help me with my homework. When I'm scared and I had a nightmare, they're going to comfort me and dry my tears. My physical and emotional needs are going to be addressed. But I also have big questions like I prayed and prayed and prayed, and I asked God to stop Dad from touching me sexually, but it still kept happening. So what does that say about God or me or both? These are really profound questions. And if they're not addressed in a healthy way, it impairs the ability of the child to cope physically and emotionally. Again, Viktor Frankl, it's not suffering that's unbearable, it's suffering without meaning. Spirituality is often how we make meaning out of that suffering. So both of those components need to be in play. When I teach faith leaders, I say, if you're working with, say, an adult survivor of abuse, you have to understand ACE and basic trauma research, because if you don't, you're going to focus on their alcoholism, their drug addiction, their unfaithfulness to their spouse, the perpetual loss of the control of their anger, right? You're going to focus on what in the Christian community we often call sins. But if you're trauma-informed, you're going to shift from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. What's driving you to get drunk? What's driving you to get drunk and have sex with somebody you're not married to? What happened to you that is driving you to engage in these behaviors? It doesn't mean we ignore their needs for evidence-based medical and mental health care, but it does mean we're going to shift the conversation in spiritual care. Stay within your lane. You're not a doctor. You're not a psychiatrist. Make a referral to an evidence-based practitioner who will also coordinate that medical and mental health care with your spiritual care. So many survivors of abuse say to clinicians, I hate it. I hate it. I went to my pastor. They gave me a prayer, a Bible verse. It's like, take 2 aspirin, you'll be better in the morning. That's not a realistic depiction of recovery from abuse. Ministry is for life, and many survivors of abuse may need to talk to you until their dying day. And so we need to be prepared for that up and down struggle for a long period of time. Don't require forgiveness. For many survivors, they say, I go to my pastor, and right away they go to passages in the Bible about the importance of forgiveness. Don't get me wrong, forgiveness is a good thing. It's a gift of God, and there are some studies saying it can be part of healing. But if you're saying to a victim, let's talk about forgiveness, you sound exactly like the perpetrator, because that's what the perpetrator said to the child in the church after they raped them. That was a sin, but you also committed a sin because you had a biological reaction, and the pastor would condemn both of us, but it's all washed away in the blood of the Lamb. I forgive you, you forgive me, God forgives both of us, and if you can't forgive me, God won't forgive you on Judgment Day. That's the sort of thing that offenders routinely say to their victims. And if you're right away going to forgiveness, you sound exactly like the perpetrator. Let's talk about justice. Let's talk about mercy. Let's talk about righteous indignation. Let's talk about why Jesus flipped over the tables in the temple, right? That's closer to where the victim needs to start with. Forgiveness is a gift of God. It'll come on its own. It doesn't have to be forced. You may work with an adult survivor who says, yeah, I'm a good Christian. I got to sit down with mom or dad who abused me as a child. When you come to our course, we go through the cognitive distortions of offenders. Even if an offender admits sexually abusing a child, they still don't put their head on the pillow saying, I'm a child molester. They justify their misconduct. Martin Moran was sexually abused at a summer church camp. And in his memoirs, he says, I go to the nursing home to track down the now old man who raped me as a child. And I was surprised. The man said, hey, Marty, don't you remember when I was touching you sexually, you were a stutterer, you were shy, you were awkward. Everybody was bullying you, right? And me touching you sexually is how I got you out of your shell. Do you honestly think you'd be a famous actor today if I hadn't touched you sexually? And Moran in his book says, I'm driving away away from the nursing home thinking, is that right? Is the reason I'm a famous actor today is because this guy touched me sexually? When you put a victim in the same room with the offender, even if the offender admits the crime, they're still going to be justifying it. They're going to be emotionally abusing the child or the adult survivor all over again. So if you've got an adult who wants to have that conversation, you got to encourage them to talk it through with their mental health provider. If they're still going to go ahead with it, you got to have a safety plan. Where's the meeting going to take place? How are we going to make sure it's safe? Who are going to be the other professionals in the room to stop the conversation and help you monitor your emotions after it takes place? We have to be very careful about these sorts of things. And then I say theologically, you may have a victim who says something that you disagree with or is debatable, but it's not about you and about your personal construct. It's about, what does this person need to survive? What do they need to get through the next 24 hours? I've had many victims who say, I love Jesus because he was sexually abused. And I always say to survivors, tell me about that. And one survivor said, my dad made me take off all my clothes and be naked, and he'd comment on my body. And he'd make fun of my body. And I've now read that Jesus was probably crucified in the nude as part of the Roman humiliation of a largely Jewish population. And yeah, that is sexual abuse in the broadest sense of the word. I've had survivors say, oh, I've read that the Roman soldiers would often rape their victims. There's nothing in the Gospels that say that happened to Jesus. There is a reference that he was taken into a praetorium. And so some people speculate maybe there were additional forms of abuse he endured that the inspired writers did not record. We can't say that. But my point is, if a survivor is latched onto that and it gives them some strength to get through the next day, I'd be reluctant to take it away from them. And this is a problem in both the conservative and the liberal wings of the church. A few years ago, the bishop of the ELCA said there's no such thing as hell, or if there is, nobody goes there. And soon thereafter, I had three or several of my friends in the LCA reached out to me and said, I don't know what to do now. I don't know how to get through the next day because my dad abused me as a child. He died unrepentant. And I've always took comfort in the idea of judgment, that there'd be a reckoning, that Jesus was serious when he said he'd send away those who failed to care for the least of these. Don't get me wrong. None of these victims were taking comfort in the idea of their fathers burning in hell, but they took comfort in the idea of justice, and now a theologian had taken away that from them. And so if you come to their course, we do a much deeper dive on things like that. And the basic teaching point is to put a lot of thought in what you say in a Bible study or from the pulpit. How may this be understood or misunderstood by a survivor of abuse in your congregation? And then we go through research on what evidence-based spiritual care looks like. Research says the answer to bad theology is good theology. It's almost like cognitive behavioral therapy. So how does that work? There was a case in the Baptist church where a minister sexually abused his daughter. And the daughter said, I think this is sinful. I don't think we should be doing this. And her dad says, well, there are exceptions in the Bible. And he opens the Bible to the creation of the world in Genesis and says, when it was just Adam and Eve, God used incest to get the world going. And then after the great flood, God again used incest to repopulate the earth. And you know how often, daughter of mine, God comes to us in a dream, Joseph and the like. God has come to me in a dream and said, I have to touch you sexually to prepare you to be a young mother because our church is under attack from without. I don't want to do it. Sort of like when God said to Abraham, you got to sacrifice your son. Abraham didn't want to do it, but he assumed God had some reason. So we just have to have faith here. Now that's about as horrible a theology as you can communicate to a child. Research says the answer to bad theology is good theology, but it's not giving the victim an answer, it's leading them to possibilities. Let's do a Bible study today. Let's do a study about the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. What are you seeing here? I'm seeing the devil tempt Jesus. And what is the devil quoting? He's quoting the Bible. What do we learn from that? I guess not everybody who quotes the Bible is representing God. That's a really good observation, yeah. And how does Jesus respond? He puts it all in context, right? Well, let's do that now. Let's talk about the creation of the world. It really has nothing to do with the sexual abuse of children. Let's look at other passages and learn what Jesus actually had to say about the sexual abuse of children and the like. research says that sort of approach can be effective. When I went through seminary, my professor jotted this on the board, and I thought it was brilliant, so I took a picture. I don't know what to say, I don't know what to do, but I'm going to stick with you till we figure it out together. You may work with a victim who has so many needs. They've got drug problems and alcohol problems and marital problems, and tremendous feelings of guilt, and they suffer from depression, and they can't control their anger, and they're pregnant, and their husband just left them, and they're about to lose their job. You just don't know where to start, right? Start with honesty. I'm not sure what to say or what to do. I'm going to stick with you till we figure it out together, one day at a time, for as long as it takes. Ministry is for life, and if you don't agree with that, it's just not a good job for you to have. Ministry is for life, and we're going to take it one day at a time. In the Southern Baptist Convention Caring Well report, they had this graph, which I thought was brilliant. They said most pastors like the upper graph: shame, guilt, growth, joy. I'm all better. I'm all healed. It's like a 4-step process. I don't have to worry about my abuse anymore. It's just not realistic. I realized something bad happened. I feel guilty. Deep breath. Oh, I'm moving toward peace. Oh, I feel really great. I'm in fellowship with God again. Oops, something on TV last night was a trigger, and I just can't get out of bed today. It's this up and down process that may go on until we reach the other side of the shore. And we just need to be realistic in our understanding of working with those who've endured severe trauma. This was a study done in the secular community children's advocacy centers in Maine and across the country, just documenting how often these abused kids are raising religious questions. Am I still a virgin in God's eyes? I prayed to God to stop the abuse, but it kept happening. And they found that a lot of CACs are just ignoring the questions because they don't know what to do. Some CACs make a referral to their mental health providers, but most mental health providers, they're just not fluent in the research on the spiritual impact of trauma. They don't know what to do. Some make a referral. Oh, the kid's Jewish. I'll get a rabbi. They're pastor. They're Baptist. I'll bring in a pastor. They're Catholic. I'll bring in a priest, right? But only 3% of clergy are trauma informed. Only 3% had any education at their seminary level. So even if they're well-meaning, they often muck it up. So this study said we have to dramatically improve the knowledge of our secular child protection community. We got to dramatically improve the knowledge of our faith community, and we got to get them in the same room and teach them how to work together, which was music to our ears, because for 20 years we've been trying to do that with limited success. I have a seminary degree in addition to a Juris Doctor degree, and so there's some links that Catherine or others are going to put in the chat. I co-edited this special seminary journal, which had a whole series of articles that can be resources for you. Some of you, I'm told, are Baptists, so the Light magazine, Hidden in Plain Sight, is online and had a whole series of really good articles that might be of assistance. Faith Trust Institute has a whole bunch of videos and the like, and if you're, say, a chaplain working across faith traditions, they've got a lot of ecumenical resources. I do a lot with Sacred Spaces. I do a lot of work in the Jewish community, and Sacred Spaces has extraordinary resources if you're ever working with a survivor of abuse in the Jewish community. Boz and I are both on the board of directors of Grace, and Grace has a wealth of resources as well. This was my treatise, or my thesis for seminary, that was published as a book. The SBC Caring Well report, the Light magazine recommended it, and it's been used in teaching some of our seminary courses. And just does a deep dive on what do we know about child abuse at the time of Jesus, and really puts into context the shocking things that Jesus said about children, how the early church actually said we're going to distinguish ourselves from the Roman Greco community by our treatment of children generally, and specifically how we address child abuse. And so the book raises the question, what happened? How did we veer so far away from the teachings of Jesus and the early practices of the church? And the Caring Well report cited my book and said, that makes sense. We don't actually have to do anything new. We need to do something very old, and take seriously everything that Jesus said about children. And if you're working outside the Christian community, you could do something similar with the sacred texts of all of the world's foremost religious traditions. This is one of several books that could help you in that regard. a lot of kids are abused. They're just never going to come to you. You're never going to hear their experience, but they are watching you. And if you can help them stay in school and be involved in sports and band, you're building resilience. If you're a positive role model as a pastor or youth minister, you're building a sense of resilience in them. And if you can help them develop healthy friendships, anything you can do to make their parents just a little bit better, if you can help create a safe community and make sure that there's no bullying or cruelty going on in your church, you are building resilience in them, and that may be a significant buffer for the rest of their life. They are watching you, and they are paying attention to whether you ever talk about it, preach about it. If you're engaged in personal safety lessons, it does impact them in the short and long term. And I love that quote from Bonhoeffer. All right, I went a little long, but that's just the nature of being a lawyer. Sorry about that. But we still have 15 minutes. I'd be happy to answer any questions or listen to any comments you may have. And please take advantage of it. There are very, very few times in your life where you could ask a lawyer a question and not get a bill. This is one of those safe times. Was this helpful to you? Did it give you a thought or two of next steps or things to work on?
I thought it was amazing, and how you were able to give a snapshot into what is covered over the 3 days is just amazing. So when we do the 3-day conference for faith leaders, it'll be out of the same Portland location, the First Baptist Church on Canco Road in Portland. When we do that, who do you think, Victor, should be there?
Everybody who wants to come. So I think it's really important for pastors to be there because you kind of send the message for the faith community as a whole. And then obviously anybody who's working with youth, so your Sunday school teachers and confirmation instructors and volunteers working with youth, it's good to encourage them to come as well. And then who are the leaders in your congregation that would have to implement policies? The more of them you can get to come, the better off you are, because then when you implement policies, you may get pushback. People say, do I really need to do that? Do I need to do a background check on all those people? And gosh, that screening process seems pretty convoluted and the like. So the more your leaders are educated, the stronger they are to say, hey, I understand where you're coming from, but here's why that policy is really important. And to send to the message, hey, it's not just about keeping kids safe. It's also a witness of our faith to the adults and others in our congregation who are victims of abuse. They pay attention to how seriously we take these issues. So it's also a witness of our faith to the watching community that we take this issue really seriously. Oh, okay, that makes sense. I guess I'm okay in doing that. And then really anybody who's interested can come. I would say, if you're just inviting everybody, we can help you, and Catherine can help you to give a trigger warning, because it's really hard. It's impactful when you come to the training. We show some videos. We got a sex offender abused 100 kids in a church, and he just talks about how he operated. And if you're a victim of abuse, this is hard to watch, right? And we got some videos of survivors saying how it impacted their faith and the like, and we do that because the case study really brings to life what the research is saying, but it's hard to watch. And we've got a module on physical abuse where we kind of go through, here are signs of physical abuse, and I have some pictures. They're not autopsies, but there are things you might see. So what does a handprint on a child look like? And so it's hard to go through the course. It's not a pick-me-upper. We're talking about really hard stuff, and we do talk about personal safety, and we're checking in on people, and we usually have a mental health provider if folks are having a hard time, but really give a good trigger warning, because sometimes survivors come and they think it's just going to be healing and empowering, but it's really triggering and impactful, and it's bringing up a lot of really hard memories. And so we have to really be vigilant in educating everybody, and you don't want to just say, hey, all you Sunday school teachers, it's you're required to do it, but say we're really encouraging you, but you never know. One of them may be a survivor of abuse, and they're just not in a place where they could go through the training and to create space where they could come to you and say, I really need to opt out of that, Pastor. I'm just not in a good place right now.
One of the things that, so we did this 3-day conference for faith leaders in 2019. What I'll tell you is we had about 375 people participate. I think we had like 80 sheriff come, social workers, child advocates, few people in the ministry. And I'll tell you that every person that came stayed for the full 3 days. So what I hear from people is, that's too long. I can't commit to 3 days. Where am I going to find time for 3 days? Blah, 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 blah. Every person that attended that conference in 2019 was mesmerized, stayed on that, stayed for the entire 3 days. We had a food truck, so nobody needed to leave for lunch. It was so well done. We had social workers who've been in the business for 25 years. One little old cranky lady, it's too hot in here. It's too cold in here. The light bulb doesn't, she was the complainer. And at the end of it, she said, this was the best training I have ever been to in my entire career. And I made her repeat that when I recorded it because she was such a pain for 3 days. Like, I want to record you. So the reason why we're doing this Zoom is because it's time to do that again. The sound of freedom is out. Everybody's wondering, what can we do? What can we do in our communities? What can we do in our congregation? And when I had asked Victor, how can we have the greatest impact? How can we help our main community? What is like the top thing we can do? And he said, educate your faith community. Educate your faith community. So we did that, and how that works. There's no sale. It's not like the final few minutes and we're going to hit you with the sale or something. It is free of charge to you. My organization raises the money, pays Victor's team, pays for the building, pays for the food truck, pays for everything. And it is a love offering to our community. It is 100% free. There is no sales pitch. There is no even passing the hat. This is, please come, please bring your people, because educating our faith community is the best thing we can do to prevent the ripple effect that happens after a child is sexually abused. So if our goal is to protect children so that we don't have kids incarcerated, addictions, sex trafficking, so many of the awful things that happen, we have to start at home, our faith home. And in order for that to happen, we need to educate. And in order to educate, I need the faith leaders to show up and bring their people and bring other faith leaders so that we can have as many people there during that 3-day. So that was what this was about. So some of my pushback was, we don't know if these guys are Christian enough. We don't know what sort of materials they're going to teach. So we said, okay, let's do a Zoom so you can hear Boz, so you can hear Victor, so you can see what the presentation is like, so you can ask any questions that you have. We're going to record it because we have 300 interested churches, and not everybody, most people work. So we're like, we'll record this and we'll pass this along. So if it's not a question for you, what do you think another pastor who's listening, what sort of question would they want to know? And let's take advantage of the last few minutes we have of Victor being here to answer those questions. What do you guys have?
And Catherine, I just wanted to confirm, because you're talking about faith leaders, that if people have friends that are part of the Jewish community or the Muslim community, that this is going to be open for them, right?
Yes.
As I hear you say that.
Yes.
So this is not a specifically meant to be a Christian doctrine teaching, but it is a great resource for all of these communities, so we can invite neighbors or coworkers, and they don't have to worry that we're going to try and sell them or evangelize them to try and become something that they're not.
Right. I mean, I would love to ask people to, to become believers, but we don't do that. Right. We don't do that. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Troy, did you have a question? I thought you leaned in. He's saying he's okay. All right.
Yeah. I mean, Mark, I just build on that. At Zero Abuse, we're a secular organization. We address abuse in all communities. And so, I mentioned the work I do is Sacred Spaces. So I do a lot of work in the Jewish community. And so from our secular standpoint, do you have children in your congregation? Then we want to help you. I think what Catherine is communicating is our sensitivity to all the faith traditions in the audience. I'm not going to say you've got to change your view of the world through a Baptist or Lutheran or Catholic or Jewish or Muslim lens. I'm going to try to work within that lens. And as you work on, say, the case studies, you would apply your lens to help the victim in the case study. Yeah.
Well, I think I want to ask just to try and clarify for people to understand, say, what's the specific purpose on this?
Yeah.
So. Yeah.
Yeah. And if you go through the full 3 days, you'll hear a lot of stories of abuse in multiple faith traditions. There is no discrimination here. Every faith community has had child abusers, and yeah.
I think it's a wonderful opportunity to unite with other faith leaders, regardless of what that is. What better thing to collaborate and unify about? So if we could all come together, varying religions, and come to this 3-day with Victor and Boz and other speakers too. It is so rich and ripe with information. I mean, it's heartbreaking, but it's also hopeful. So you've got just a quick little cliff note, just a taste for who they are, the kind of men, godly men that they are, and what their presentation looks like. It is so beautifully done over those 3 days, and it ends with hope. So you really feel like, sometimes you attend sex trafficking things or child sexual abuse things, and you just, people leave and the oxygen has left the room. That's not. I mean, you feel like you just got a 3-day college education, and so you are aware. You can never not, you are now aware. And you're left with, okay, there is a lot we can actually do about this. This isn't MS. It's not cancer. It's not, Lou Gehrig's disease. Like, this is, if we can prevent access, that's all we have to do is prevent access. We can't stop, people who are who they are, but we can prevent access. And that in and of itself would make such a significant difference in our community. So, and the way that we do that is to educate people and normalize that 2-person deep that Victor was talking about. Like, boy, that's just huge. Yeah. So you've got 1 minute now to, if anybody has any questions, any comments, now is your time to do it before I set Victor free. By the way, he educates over 30,000 people across the country. So for us to grab this very busy man and grab an hour and a half of his time today is significant.
Couple other quick thoughts. Most programs on child abuse that faith communities go to they're driven by insurance companies or law firms, and so they narrowly focus on preventing sexual abuse within the institution. And the reason for that is those are the kids that might grow up to sue you. That is not the approach we take here, because that approach leaves unprotected the vast majority of abused children in your community. It leaves unprotected all the kids that are being physically abused, emotionally abused, neglected, all the kids that are being sexually abused in their home. There's more sexual abuse in the home than there is in the church. And so this is about protecting the 100% of the kids, because I just don't think you want to appear before God someday and say, I protected those kids who might sue me. The other kids I wasn't worried about. I just think ethically, morally, we try to protect 100% of them. We're not pushing anybody off of the boat here. And then I would also say, and it's irony of ironies, and this is the difference between talking to a lawyer and an insurance company and a child abuse expert. A child abuse expert would say, you can't even protect kids from sexual abuse within the church, if that's your narrow goal, unless you protect them from abuse in the home, because abuse in the home is the feeding system for abuse in the church. The offender knows, if I got a kid who's been abused in multiple ways, they have all these trauma signs, it's like a neon flashing light, and I'm going to take advantage of that and worm my way into that child's life and abuse them all over again. So one goal of the course is to get you at least as skilled as a sex offender in your community to identify kids who are enduring trauma in their home so that you can get to them before somebody else does. I would also say this is the messy course, right? A lot of people don't like messy, and so they don't want to come to this course, right? I love Catherine, all the work she's doing on trafficking, but trafficking is down the road. And for some faith communities, that's safe because it's down the road, right? I'm not worried about that. But this, where you might talk about abuse in the home and I might have to make a report, that's messy. That's ugly. The community may divide. What if the parent who's abusing their child is the president of my congregation, right? This is how people lose their job as a minister. I don't want messy. I feel comfortable in my ignorance. This is not a course for those who don't like messy. That this is a course for people who really feel that God wants them to roll up their sleeves and deal with the messy, the tough, the really hard things in life, and that distinguishes us from, I think, all the other trainings that are out there.
So can I just ask Catherine, probably, when again are we looking to do the 3-day training?
It depended on what happened today.
Okay.
Like if there were faith leaders that were willing to partner with me in getting them, because I'm just one person,
Right.
getting the most faith-based organizations to show up. And if I felt like we had a team that was willing to do that, by the way, John Washington, who's recording this, he canvassed, a big section of Maine and personally invited people. I personally sent out, 300 emails, and you guys are the ones that showed up. So, God bless you. Thank you for showing up. So if you heard him and Boz and you like what you heard and you were willing to partner with me and getting as many people as possible to a 3-day event, then I will fund it. And Victor said he'll talk to Suzanne, who is the magic calendar keeper, and we'd set offer you guys a couple of different dates, see what worked for you guys, and then that would be our end goal. And then we would work together to ensure that we got people committed to showing up. And you'll be able to forward this email to those faith leaders and encourage them to be a part of our team.
So then how do we kind of sign on? How do we make sure that that you've got those people that are willing to help you?
Hold up your pinky and pinky swear with me. Troy, are you in? Are you in, Troy? I don't see your pinky, dude. There you go. All right, there we go. So that's it. So then if you would put your emails in the chat, I'll grab those emails and then I'll send you guys an email with a copy of today's presentation, and then each of you will send out to other people, and we will make what we need in our community happen.
Well, today was super helpful for me. I've been in ministry for 35 years. The amount of training I've had in this topic is super low. I've been a part of good organizations that have kind of practically enforce some of these types of things. So I've known maybe some decent practices, but to be able to have this kind of training, and then you don't know who to talk to. You just don't know who is actually going to help you and give you good advice. So I want to say thank you to everybody that was involved in this today. Thank you for taking the time and the energy to take this risk and put it together.
Okay. So, Victor, thank you. It's always you were always such a gift, and I'm privileged to to be a bridge between my community and you and your team. And I look forward to our next conference, and we'll talk to Suzanne today. I'll send her an email and see what dates, and then we'll do what we did last time. We'll just pick a date. And it won't be 30 below zero, but we'll pick a date, and then we'll just trust that that's the right date, and we'll make it happen.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Well, thank you everybody for your time. Victor, do you have any last words before we end this?
No, thanks everybody. Take care of yourselves.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody.